Well, in the Danish capital, support for Ukraine is dominating talks among European defence and foreign ministers. The EU's foreign affairs chief said that Russia is mocking peace efforts to end the war. Kaja Kallas says Europe must increase pressure on Moscow. The gathering in Copenhagen comes after a major Russian attack on Kyiv, one of the biggest since the war began. The barrage of drones and missiles killed at least 23 people, with more unaccounted for. The EU delegation office was among the buildings damaged in the strikes. Our correspondent, Rosie Birchard, is at that meeting in Copenhagen. Welcome, Rosie. There was a lot of talk today about post-war security guarantees for Ukraine. Was there consensus on what that might look like?
Well, you know, we saw over the last few weeks this total flurry of diplomacy from Vladimir Putin and President Trump meeting in Alaska right up to this meeting among EU defence ministers today. And there's a sense among the Europeans that they want to try and put some flesh on the bones to one of the concessions, really, they managed to get from Washington, which is the US saying that it was willing to participate in future security guarantees for Ukraine. So what that means is measures that could back up a ceasefire down the line. Previously, the US had said it's got to be down to the Europeans. Now, the Europeans say the US is willing to participate in some way. What will those actually look like? We've had talk of some European boots on the ground, some European countries saying they could contribute to monitoring the skies, some saying they could send ships. And now we've had something, or the start of a draft of an offer from the European Union itself, saying they would be willing to expand their current training of Ukrainian soldiers, which currently happens in European Union territory, to possibly sending trainers into Ukraine. Now, the truth is that we're talking about a measure that would happen after a ceasefire, which it does not exist, and there is really no sign of it happening anytime soon. And that's why I asked the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, if this proposed measure, this suggestion from the EU, is in any way feasible. Here's a bit of what she told me.
It's a bit also, chicken and egg issue. So like you say, it's true that we are talking about changing the mandate or training on Ukrainian soil if there's ceasefire. So some are saying that we should do it after, but we can also do it conditionally so that, we agree already how we change the mandate so that it would be conditional when the ceasefire or truce enters into force when it's actually needed.
Rosie Birchard, beyond that training for Ukraine's military, what else was said about other ways of supporting Kyiv?
There's a lot being discussed among defence ministers about ways to try and get Ukrainian arms producers to set up factories on European soil, which they say would then offer them a sort of safe haven, because we know Russia targets those defence production sites in Ukraine. And we heard from the Danish defence minister announcing that he expects within a few weeks a Ukrainian arms production site to open here in Denmark and to be producing by the end of the year. We've had other European countries saying they're willing to step up in terms of their military aid to Ukraine. And it should be noted that with that really unpredictable policy from the United States in terms of its backing for Ukraine, the Europeans have stepped up to fill that void. But that's only been to a level that has kind of sustained what Ukraine was just living on before, which has not been enough in terms of military aid to really change the course of this war. That being said, I think Ukrainians are very happy for these announcements of support, and certainly for what the Danes sometimes call the Danish model, so trying to work more with Ukrainian defence producers to build the ammunition that Ukrainians need, because of course it's Ukrainians themselves that know exactly what they need for their battlefield.
And did those defence ministers talk about what more they can do if Russia does not agree to a ceasefire?
Well, they certainly are not expecting Putin to come around anytime soon. We heard the top diplomat saying that Putin is essentially making a mockery of these attempts toward peace. And with that in mind, they say, OK, well, we need to, on the other track, really tighten the screws on the Kremlin's ability to finance this war with fresh sanctions. The EU is working on a 19th round of sanctions against Russia. But of course, 18 rounds so far. They have had some impacts on the Russian economy, but it hasn't really prompted the Kremlin to change course in any way. There are the start of a bigger discussion on confiscating and using hundreds of billions of euros, hundreds of billions of US dollars worth of Russian central bank assets, which are frozen in the European Union, and looking at the legalities and technicalities of offering them to Ukraine for its reconstruction after the war. But that's still seen as on really legally shaky ground, and there is no agreement yet. But the EU is looking at some of those measures to try and see, OK, what bigger things could they do in future if there were a ceasefire, which, as we said, for now is nowhere in sight, as we know that Ukrainians are still living under bombs.
Thanks, Rosie. Rosie Birchard in Copenhagen.
I'm now joined by Ionela Ciolan. She's a security and defence analyst at the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies. It's a leading European political think tank. Welcome to DW. Are more EU sanctions...
Thank you very much for the invitation.
...the right way to pressure Russia to end the war with Ukraine?
Yes, I personally believe that the sanctions remain one of the most important tools for Europe to constrain the Russian war machine. And this upcoming 19th sanctions package, it's perceived to be tougher and more comprehensive than the previous one. And this time, the sanction will focus especially on this shadow fleet of oil tankers, the lifeline of the crude exports of Russia. It's important to mention that each sanctioned ship makes it harder for Moscow to fund its war of aggression against Ukraine. And yes, we know that sanctions are not a quick fix, but they exert slow-burning pressure, and they are working.
Right. So I guess maybe the question could also then be, does the EU need to prepare for a sort of long-term confrontation with Russia, even after the war in Ukraine ends?
Yes, the EU must prepare for this prolonged standoff with Russia. In the past 2 years, the Russian hybrid attacks in Europe nearly tripled, and these operations aim to fracture the NATO unity and weaken the Western resilience. This shows that the Russian threat is structural, and it's not only tied to Ukraine. And for the EU, the end of the war in Ukraine will not mean a return to normal. We must build a long-term resilience to protect our infrastructure, to sustain close cooperation with NATO, because Russia will remain the most direct threat for the European security for years to come.
In your opinion, Ionela, how realistic is the possibility of a direct Russian attack on EU territory?
A direct Russian attack on the EU territory cannot be excluded. In fact, Western intelligence are increasingly warning the fact that such attack could happen in the next 3 to 5 years. Russia is building its forces to an enormous extent. It's producing 1,500 tanks annually. It's expanding its number of active militaries to 1.5 million. It's already spending 9% of GDP on defense, which is reflecting a full transition to a war economy.
So how then should the EU be strengthening its deterrence, especially at a time where trust or confidence in the United States as an ally is declining?
The Europeans have to take more responsibility for the protection of the continent and their own defense. We need to build this European Defense Union in full complementarity with NATO. That means basically also strengthening the European pillar of NATO. And in order to do that, of course, the Europeans have to significantly increase their capability spending. They have to work on implementing that NATO 5% GDP commitment, which they took at the NATO summit this summer, but also they have to invest in air and missile defense to build air and missile shield, and also they have to work on other capabilities in trying to make sure that we have modern artillery and long-range strike systems, in building more large ammunition stockpiles, in advancing with our drone and counter-drone capabilities. And on top of that, we also have to work on improving our military mobility. So basically, we have to increase our defense spending, but also we have to spend more smarter by reducing our fragmentation, by pooling resources together and boosting the European defense industry to production that can match the Russians' current production.
All right, that is the insights of Ionela Ciolan from the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies. Thanks very much. We appreciate that.
Thank you very much as well.
Now, Kristi Raik is the director of the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, Estonia. She brings deep expertise in European foreign policy, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. Welcome to DW. As we were just hearing from our correspondent, EU ministers in Copenhagen are calling for more sanctions on Russia. But haven't the numerous previous sanction packages done little to change anything?
Well, actually, sanctions have had an impact. The Russian economy is in an increasingly difficult situation. Unfortunately, this has not stopped Russia from waging war. Russia is an authoritarian system. It is very good at focusing its resources increasingly on the war economy. But it is important to further tighten the sanctions and put even more pressure economically on Russia. This is the way to make Russia realize that it cannot keep going with this war forever. At some point, its resources will be finished and it will have to consider seriously engaging in peace talks. We are not yet there, but with further pressure through sanctions, we are moving in that direction.
For quite some time now, as you know, there have been these discussions about using the frozen Russian assets that are being held in Europe to help fund the support for Ukraine. Why has it been so hard for EU member states to agree on this?
Well, first of all, this is indeed one of the most potentially effective tools that the EU would have to put further pressure on Russia. We are talking about 200 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets. And there are various legal and political considerations that have so far made many member states reluctant to move ahead and use these assets in order to support directly Ukraine. But there is progress on this issue, and this is very important now as a clear signal that the EU is looking for new instruments. There have to be ways to kind of create a mechanism then to more efficiently use these funds, if not directly kind of making them available to Ukraine, then at least finding a more efficient mechanism for using the profits and generating profits through these frozen assets and thus helping Ukraine.
Just picking up on your point about other instruments, what other ways do you see of putting real pressure on Russia?
Well, Russia is, of course, closely watching what kind of military support the US and European countries are offering to Ukraine now. And we are at a critical moment now that the US-led diplomatic process has actually not brought us any closer to a ceasefire. And we clearly see that there has to be more pressure on Russia and continued and increased military support, especially from Europeans, is one critical measure that can convince the Russian side that Ukraine will not give up, Ukraine's allies will not give up, and that Russia simply cannot gain more by continuing this war. Russia has been advancing very slowly, but Ukraine needs additional support in order to be able to block this and to change the Russian calculation.
Yeah, and Europeans are also discussing if and how European troops might be sent to Ukraine to help guarantee security and a possible ceasefire. Is this the right time to be having this conversation when the actual peace still seems far away?
Well, indeed, the issue of sending European troops to Ukraine in a way is theoretical at this point, because everyone agrees that this can only happen after a ceasefire has been established. But still, I think right now is the moment for Europeans to come forward with very clear commitments, because this is needed as a message to Russia, to see that actually Europeans are committed in the long term, and also for the US, in order for future kind of security guarantees for Ukraine to be truly effective. The US also needs to be on board, but the US has made very clear that it expects Europeans to bear the large share of the burden, and it can then support with tools that Europeans need in terms of intelligence, maybe some air force, other elements where Europeans are weak. But then the actual troops committed to Ukraine have to come from European countries, and we need to have some clear promises, clear commitments from Europeans in this regard.
All right, thank you to Kristi Raik, Director of the International Centre for Defence and Security.
Thank you.